Welcome to the last part of Chapter 10 on Latin America. We're going to start with the economy. The economy is largely export-based, and this is again a holdover from colonialism, which we saw in a lot of other regions. Lots of export based around agricultural, minerals, and then manufacturing, which I'll talk about in a minute. Mostly less developed countries in the region, but higher rates of development than in Africa and the poorer countries in Asia. However, much like some other countries in that region, corruption and instability hamper growth, depending on where you are. But the situation is improving, and there's been a lot of growth in the region. So when we look at agriculture in the region, we have two main types of agriculture. We have the latifundia and the minifundia, which was this colonial land division. And so basically, more desirable land and larger pieces of land were given to people for an export-based plantation style versus this small-scale subsistence agriculture, which is still practiced by many people in the region today. Many people in the region benefited from, again, that higher elevation and those steep slopes, by something called altitudinal zonation. And so basically, indigenous populations who were living in these steep areas realized that they could grow a lot of different types of crops in a relatively small area due to that change in temperature over that elevation. So, you can grow tropical fruits at the base of the mountain, coffee going up, and then grains like wheat and barley. And so having this wide variety of plants to eat. So again, colder temperatures means different crops, and so crop variability there is very good. There's also lots of really good volcanic soil that is good for farming. And this benefited the Aztec and the Inca and the Spanish. However, deforestation in the Amazon has been a problem. You're going to watch a short video about that after this part, but a lot of it has to do with agriculture, including beef ranching and soybean farming. So clearing out regions in order to create farms that require large inputs. Cattle is very big in the Amazon, and all cattle, even ones that are raised and then wind up in these kind of concentrated animal feeding operations, do need to graze on grass for the first 6 months of their life. Also, to a lesser extent, logging, particularly some hardwoods that are being sold. And so they have faced some of the same problems of that slash and burn agriculture in Africa that's not always sustainable. Again, rainforests have very infertile soil. When you first burn stuff down, you kind of initially fertilize the soil, but it's not very fertile soil, so you have to either move on and deforest another plot or keep putting lots of fertilizer inputs into the region. And this has global implications because that Amazon rainforest is like the lungs of the planet. They help heavily regulate the climate. And so you could see here is this piece of land right here, and you can see how deforestation has happened rapidly. You're going to watch a video about how Brazil has really slowed this process down, but it is still happening. Free trade is being heavily promoted by some out of this region, and so those are agreements that limit taxation on international trade. So basically, we can get Chilean avocados in California for a very, very cheap price. And so it's much cheaper for consumers, but it winds up being much lower wages for workers. And so there's a race to the bottom as people try to make things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to get those consumers to buy them. It's the people who are picking and growing the fruit who generally have that lowest wage. And so a lot of people have been promoting fair trade as opposed to free trade. And basically that's paying a premium for kind of this social consciousness. So there's a variety of groups that certify something as fair trade. And so basically it's cutting out middlemen, it's giving more money for the growers, and so less people are taking a piece of that on the way up, and everybody is getting a fair price. And it doesn't also is less dependence on a global market price. This is especially true for coffee. Coffee markets can fluctuate wildly, which can cause farmers to go bankrupt one year. So this is kind of securing them a decent price for their crops. And so this little graphic here, the banana split, who gets what in the banana chain, everybody is taking a chunk out of this banana that's relatively cheap for the consumers, including the retailer, the ripener, the wholesale importer, the shipper, the plantation owner, and it's that worker who's getting the smallest bit. So buying things that are fair trade, if you can afford them, is really worth it because you're ensuring that people on the kind of low end of that are getting a fair and hopefully livable wage. Lots of drugs also grown in the region. It is a profitable cash crop. There's a good climate and landscape to grow it, and there's lots of poor people and landless peasants um, who have few other economic options. There's also many inaccessible areas, so you could hide large-scale drug growing much easier, and little government control in these regions. And so the war on drugs approach that the US had for a very long time was to fight the supply side. And so basically become involved with these countries who are growing them and try to fight out that supply. But we are really, the US is the big demand for the drugs, and we're going to have to deal with that demand side, not just the supply side. So you get many violent reactions to these different wars on drugs. And basically, once you kind of remove them from one area, you have this balloon effect where that it basically just moves to another area. You fight that area, it moves back to the original area. And so when we look at the geography of the drug trade coming out of the region, there are three very important countries. Colombia, where a lot of drugs are being grown. Mexico, where some drugs are being grown, but it's a big pathway to the United States, who is again the country that is has the highest demand for these drugs. Um, Generally speaking, in Latin America, the people who are growing and selling the drugs are not doing the drugs. They are just coming in for a high demand in a U.S. market. Drugs in South America, also these cartels are often have better resources than the government. On the bottom left there, one of them had a submarine. You have the FARC rebels in Colombia, who they've recently come to some type of truce with the government, who were heavily, this rebel group was heavily funded by drug money. So they often have, these cartels have military strength, financial strength, and political strength. And again, armed rebels are funded by this drug money. Instability in the government is good for cartels. You don't want a strong central government. They can function a lot better with a weak central government. However, the situation is improving in Colombia. However, when the situation improves in one place, it tends to move to another place. You can see coca cultivation here in Bolivia. And we looked at drugs in Mexico and Central America, close proximity to the U.S., so there's pretty high stakes. And lots of money to be made. And so these cartels are competing for territory, often very violently. And you can see here on the right kind of a map from a few years ago showing the drug cartel's main areas of influence. Right, they're all fighting over territory and to get those drugs into the U.S. So corruption and violence are too normal in the region. There's the saying plato o plomo, which is basically take a bribe or take lead, right? So silver or lead. So basically for police, judges, politicians, journalists, everyone, take a bribe from a drug cartel or face violence from them. There was the 43 murdered college students in Mexico who disappeared, who were largely thought because they were protesting the government, and who was kind of in a drug cartel's back pocket. In Ciudad Juarez in 2010, which is a a city similar to size of San Diego. They had 3,000 murders, over 3,000 murders, while San Diego had 29 in the same year. So lots of drug violence. There was a major cartel leader, El Chapo, who was able in Mexico to escape from prison not once but twice. He was extradited to the U.S. because it's hoped that he can't escape a U.S. prison, but he was able to kind of buy off guards inside the prison to escape. And this also spills over into Central America, where you mostly have violence that has to do with this drug trade, but it's low-level gangs instead of cartels. And so you're going to watch a video about the unaccompanied minors who were crossing over through Mexico into the United States. The video is from a few years ago when there was a boom of this, but it was a lot of people just trying to escape gang violence in Central America. And again, it's very, very hard to keep people in places in law enforcement for very long. And so a lot of people are unwilling to take these jobs. Recently, a 20-year-old criminology student in Mexico took the job as a police chief and then shortly had to flee Mexico for the U.S. after death threats against her if she wouldn't work for the drug cartels. Moving on to manufacturing. Lots of manufacturing in the region. It's present in most countries. Mexico and Brazil and other medium developed countries are doing lots of high-tech manufacturing, televisions, airplanes, etc. We have maquiladoras that are set up on the border in Mexico. And so basically we have assembly happening in these plants, on these border cities, and then because of NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement, we're able to cross these goods across the border very, very quickly. And so if we look at a Google map, right, we have, here's the United States, here's Mexico. We have lots of maquiladoras, these factories that are directly on the border and can very easily get those goods into Mexico. In Central America, you have more low-tech, especially clothing, although a lot of that is starting to transfer to Asia. And so we have something called the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico. It allows goods to travel pretty freely across the border. The White House was considering withdrawing from NAFTA. Then they said that they weren't going to withdraw from NAFTA. They might try to renegotiate NAFTA, but this agreement, while definitely some sectors of the economy have been left behind, has been shown to make a lot of money for both sides of the border, so a lot of people would be hurt by us pulling out of NAFTA. Lots of minerals and mining in the region. It is resource rich, especially in South America. Copper, silver, bauxite, etc. Oil in Ecuador and Venezuela. But it's very hard work for very, very low wages. And so again, that resource curse is common that we saw in sub-Saharan Africa. So here are some striking bauxite miners looking for better wages and better conditions. We have the Chilean miners in 2010, which made global news when they were stuck in that mine for nearly a month. But very hard work, very dangerous work, very low paying work. And so the people who are benefiting from these minerals are generally not the people working there, right? It's these larger corporations. And especially if we look at silver mining in Bolivia, it can be very environmentally polluting and devastating as well. And so we see that same resource curse that we see in sub-Saharan Africa, but we don't have the same warfare and fighting over it that we do in sub-Saharan Africa. I just want to talk about a couple economies of interest here. Venezuela, which has been in the news a lot lately, their economy is based entirely on oil. There's no agriculture, no tourism, etc., etc. This contrasts with a country like the United Arab Emirates, which I talked about, which is investing that oil money back into the country and trying to diversify that economy to deal with fluctuating oil prices and also for when we run out of oil. The global price of oil has dropped, and so now this country is broke, really high inflation, problems with food shortages, and no electricity. So gas here, this is actually pretty cheap. This is liters, but they're paying nearly $20 for carrots, right? So fuel is pretty cheap, but food is not. And so there's been many protests in the country um, due to the fact that there are food shortages, and people have even tried to crowdfund money to get out of the country because there's no economic opportunity for them right now. When we look at migration in the region, it's mostly an economic issue, mostly. Again, those unaccompanied minors that you're going to watch that video about, that's not an economic issue. That's a fleeing a violence issue in Central America. But generally speaking, um, there's a lack of labor and wages in less developed countries, and there's a surplus in developed countries like the U.S. So we have an outmigration from the region, mostly to the U.S. A lot of people crossing over through Mexico, but a lot of them are not Mexican. They are from Central America or places in South America. And so in the U.S. right now, we have approximately 12 million Mexican born. But again, that's not counting all the people from Central America. And also, while the border walls securing the border has been in the news a lot lately, there are actually more Mexicans leaving the U.S. currently than are entering, due to a variety of economic reasons. But we have lots of people from the region, 1.1 million people from Cuba, um, which is not just an economic issue, but a lot of people also seeking political asylum. 1.1 from El Salvador, 900,000 from the Dominican Republic. Many enter without authorization, and they are at the greatest risk. People crossing through the desert, it's extraordinarily dangerous. Um, and lots of people die and are never found who cross in these very, very dangerous areas. Also, a lot of people who do make it into the U.S. and then are immediately deported will get dropped off in Mexico. However, they are often not from Mexico or from a different, very, very different part of Mexico, and they have almost no money when they get back into Mexico. And there's a variety of people there who take advantage of them. Also, places like Tijuana are dealing with an increasing homeless population of people who have just been deported from the U.S. We also have different streams within the region. That biggest stream is from Central America going to Mexico, and small streams into the region from elsewhere, mostly from Asia. Remittances is money sent to home from abroad, uh, which is a big source of money for a lot of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially in Mexico. So $66 billion a year is sent from the U.S. to Latin America through remittances. So basically, these workers are functioning like an export, right? These countries are, in a sense, sending workers there and making money off of them. This is good and bad for Latin America. It does bring money into their economy, but you do lose labor, skills, tax revenue, and social capital. There's also a problem with things like brain drain, where let's say you go to college in your country, you become a doctor or a nurse, you can now make a lot more money doing that in the United States or in Europe, so you wind up leaving the region. This has especially been true with nursing in places like Jamaica. There's been a mass outflow of nurses from Jamaica as the U.S. had a nursing shortage, and now Jamaica has a nursing shortage, but they can't afford to pay nearly as much as the U.S. does for nurses. Lots of tourism due to proximity to the U.S. and Canada, including low labor costs and warm weather. So if you're on the East Coast in the United States, there's a good chance if you're going on vacation, you're thinking about going to the Caribbean, to a place like Atlantis and the Bahamas. And all of these places look very, very pretty, but if you look at some footage right outside of these places, generally they're pretty poor. Many island countries have few other options than this type of tourism, and there are positive and negatives, right? It's good that they get jobs and influx of cash. However, this uneven development happens. So you get these areas that are kind of taken over by these resorts. You get this cultural erosion that happens, but then the people who are working there are actually making very, very little. Very often the resorts are owned by people from other countries. And so you can get these slums that are very, very close to these resort areas. And some places, while from a physical geography perspective, will be a great place for tourism, instability in the region, such as drug violence in Mexico and Colombia, hampers that. Baja took a huge hit to their tourism business during that last round of drug violence, 2010, 2011. There's a lot of building there that stopped. Many people stopped going to Ensenada for the weekend or to Rosarito for the weekend, and those places are just starting to recover now. So in some places, ecotourism or this kind of ecologically based tourism, like in Costa Rica, is very popular, and it can be done very sustainably and very profitably. And Costa Rica is a great example of that. A couple other economic countries of interest, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, two countries on the same island, the island of Hispaniola. Um, in Haiti, you had a dictatorship and poverty and democracy and growth in the Dominican Republic. And you can see here, Haiti has this all used to look the same. Haiti heavily deforested due to poverty. A lot of people had to take the resources out of the forest, including just for doing things like making charcoal, while the Dominican Republic did not do that and protected their forest, and they're in a lot better shape. Places like Cuba, which has been communist since 1959. You'll learn a little bit more about Cuba um, with the Che Guevara video. But the U.S. Put an embargo against Cuba, basically not allowing outside goods to come in. We have recently normalized relations again with them, although that might change. It was President Obama who did that. Um, that might change under the current administration. The idea being that the embargo did not work to change the regime, and so let's open them up to the West a little bit through trade and tourism, and perhaps this will foster some type of political change. Then you have the country of Brazil, which has a huge economy and had growth and stability um, after decades of military rule, but now has experienced a lot of economic turmoil. And so we have growing inequality, huge corruption scandals, the Zika virus, which devastated the area a lot, and a recession. And they hosted the World Cup and the Olympics recently, and it brought a lot of negative attention. There's a mural there of a starving child trying to eat a soccer ball. And so a lot of people in the country are very upset that the country was investing in these big international events while not taking care of their own people. So that is the end of Chapter 10 on Latin America. You'll proceed on to your exercises and your country journal for this module.